Howdy folks, I'm Mark, and today we're talking about part 9 of our Swatchity Code-Along series, News and Content Management. So what is Swatchity? Seriously, 9 videos in you're still asking that? Just click on the thing in the upper right. Back when I had the original idea for Swatchity in the mid-2010s, one of the main purposes of the project was to experiment with alternative ways of telling stories. Now that I'm making a new version, almost a decade later, it makes sense to flesh out the story with some new plot beats to fill in the gap between the old and new versions of the site. It also served as a nice way of tying in another side project, a parody corporate website called flurbco.com. And to do that, we're going to need a content management system, or CMS, and building that in Next is a great deal of fun, and I'm going to show you exactly how we put that together. First thing we're going to do is take a look at the user-facing part of the news feature. So when we click on the news icon, we're sent to this page with several news stories. We have exactly 12 at this point, starting with the launch of Swatchity 8 years ago, up until it was reacquired by the fictitious parent company Flurbco just a month or so ago. So let's click on one of these pieces, and you see that we have a large image here, and we have 2-column text. That 2-column text is just CSS that makes that happen, and we can go down to more news that'll take us back to where we were. So the layout for this is pretty simple, but you'll notice that this is not a JPEG. It's actually an inline SVG file. And what's great about it is, no matter how big I make it, because it's SVG, it doesn't take up any more space. In fact, and we'll look at it later, these are actually data strings that are loaded directly into the image source. Let's take a look at how we do that in the code. And then in a second part, we're going to take a look at the admin panel and how we do that. Let's take a look at the schema. And right away, you can see that we have content type here. Even though we only have one content type, a news post, we want to have the option of adding another content type down the road. We also have our minimum level. This is a holdover from the old site where some of the blog posts wouldn't appear until you were a higher level. We're not doing that for this version because it was important to me that everybody get access to all of the blog posts from the beginning, because frankly, I like these 12 blog posts and the story that they tell. The slug is part of the URL, so if you're familiar with the way CMSs work, the slug is added here, and then we do our dynamic routing in Next. Image featured and image thumbnail, you see these are strings. These are not URLs, these are actually data strings, the way you might take a bitmapped image and make a base 64 out of it. We're not really using tags at this point. Meta description is used for SEO. Our main content, which is obviously all of this text. This is actually Markdown. So instead of using HTML tags for the link that we have here, we're actually just using Markdown. I love Markdown. I use it for all of my notes. I've used that for years. I'm very familiar with the syntax, and what I find really fun about this is this allows us to do this without using dangerously set HTML or anything like that for adding those kinds of items. And we'll get into how we do that. We have a color, and the color is used for this display here. Usually we pick the color based on the background of the image or some version of that color. We have active, publish date, and the stuff you would expect to see there as well. So for this page that we're looking at, this is the code that runs that page. It's very simple. Get server-side props is really only pulling in our post summaries. So this is a server-side function. We are going to pull in all of the posts, and note that for the front end of the website, we're using active only, and we would set that to true. And then in our admin panel, we would set that to false, so we could see all of the posts, not just the active ones, right? Because then if you set it inactive, then that post would disappear and you couldn't edit it anymore. Then we pull in all of our posts, and we pack an object we call post summaries. You know, there are some fields that we don't need, so we can make it a little bit lighter when we pass it back. And if we don't have anything at all, we just pass back an empty array. So we pass in our initial posts and our can load more. This is because we have the option of having pagination, but we currently are not really using it because I set the maximum number of items per page more than the 12 that are here, because I wanted all of them to be visible. And that's really all there is to this page. For our news detail page in the get server-side props, we're pulling in the slug. Again, that's this item up here for our dynamic routing. We're going to use that slug in our get post by slug db function, which could not be simpler, right? We're looking up our post by the slug, which should be unique. And if it exists, we return it. If it doesn't, we return nothing. And we serialize our dates. In the page itself, you can see that we have our layout and we have this big image here. We say height and width. That's just to give us the aspect ratio. It's going to, as we can see in the style, it's going to fill the space that we give it as a responsive image, right? So there we go. This is an SVG in the format of an inline string. We pump this into the source of our image component. Now we're using the next image component. We don't necessarily need to do that because we're not taking advantage of some of the cool next image optimization features, but it doesn't hurt things, so that's where we have that. And then we have our title block here in our H1. So over here we have our post content as a child of our React Markdown component, which we're pulling in from the React Markdown library. And we have our components object here, which is sort of a config for how we're interpreting our Markdown in this instance. In this case, we're taking all of our links and making them new tab links. And of course, we have our button for look at more news, which is just going to send us back to the news page. So this is a very simple page. What I really want to talk to you about is our CMS itself, our admin panel, where we can create new posts and we can go and edit them. So let's take a look at the edit page. We have many of the fields that we saw in our schema. We have our title, our slug, that minimum user level feature that we're not really using. If we wanted to make this invisible to the public, we could just say not active. We have the publish date. We're just using a straight ahead off-the-shelf library for the date picker. Tags, we're not really using this feature, but we have that for the future. Meta description, and then we have this here. So these are two separate SVG images that I ran through a converter so we can use them as data image strings. We can directly inject those into the source attribute on an image and be able to see them that way. And here we have our main content, and you can see we have a markdown formatted link right here, and the rest is pretty straightforward. One thing I really like about using Markdown is not only am I very comfortable with Markdown, it's also much easier than making P tags or automatically injecting them or BR tags. It's just so much easier to work this way. Plus, you could avoid dangerously set HTML. The other field here, of course, is post color. That blue is kind of hard to see on that dark background, but we can change the color. And so that's how the admin panel operates. Let's take a look at how this works in the code. So our index page is going to be very similar to the news index page we see on the front end. The main difference being that we're saying false here. So we saw this get post summaries DB, the server side function. This argument tells us whether or not we only want to see active items. Right, so this says false, so we can see the ones that are inactive, so we don't make them disappear from our admin panel. We list the items. You can link through to the detail page for each of those. That's really all we're doing here. The real meat, so to speak, of this feature takes place on this page, which is a big old form. One thing you'll notice about the admin pages on the site is they are admin protected. Admin protected component is pretty simple. All it does is it checks to see if you're logged in based on the use user context, and it checks your role. If you are not logged in or you are not an admin, it just says you really shouldn't be here. Otherwise, we return the content that we're wrapping. Now, normally you might have two forms, one for creating a post and one for editing a post. In my case, I didn't want to go that route. So when you create new post, it's going to create a post for you using some default data and then redirect you to editing that. And because the slug has to be unique, just in case you create 2 in a row, rather than breaking things, we have a random string here for your slug to start with. Another API route that's very important is reading the items. So we talked about get post summaries DB. We already looked at that function, and this API endpoint will give us access to that. This is how we read more posts on the admin panel or on the user-facing news page. And update post, we make sure that you're a real user based on the server-side session. We also make sure that you have a role of admin. Otherwise, what are you doing? We have our validate with rules that we've looked at earlier, right? Each of these kinds of functions, we have a set of rules that we can use on the front end and the back end. And then we take that information, we let Prisma parameterize our inputs from the user to make sure we're safe. And on this page, we also have each of these fields has a generic handle form change function where we're doing the old React trick of eTarget name, eTarget value, right? We have an exception for the is active check up here, but it's all basically the same thing. And our save form will do the update post, an API function that pulls the API route for update post. And if it's successful, we send a toaster message saying you're successful, an internationalized message. And if you're not, it'll tell you that too, an internationalized message. And that is how all of this works. One thing that I completely forgot to mention is now that we have our news feature and we have content for it, we actually have something in our ugly right sidebar. It's not as ugly anymore, right? So we have news, we have top swatches, and we have swatchers, this top swatchers. So we have an API route that pulls that data for us. It pulls 5 of the most recent posts, right? So we're ordering by publish date descending. It grabs the top swatches, highest number of likes. Then it grabs the 5 top users based on their score. And we grab that information in our use user context. When a user loads the page, we initiate this global context. And as part of that, we grab the sidebar content while we're here and store that so we're not pulling it over and over again. And it is provided through our context here. In our sidebar, we're grabbing the sidebar content from user context, and then we have a function to get avatar data from the user meta. That could probably be moved into a helper file, but the basic idea here is that this is what draws all of that stuff. The most recent news, the top swatches, and the top swatchers are all pulled in here, right? The one thing that I wanted to mention as well is we're using this sticky component from React Sticky Node, and that is what allows us to have the content stick to the top or to the bottom as we scroll. It's kind of bouncing around a little bit because my computer is getting tired when I record video for too long. I really enjoyed writing these 12 blog posts to kind of give you the story of this fake company and its fake parent company and creating these images and all the other stuff. This was a lot of fun to do. I happen to be a real CMS nerd. I love making homegrown CMSs just for fun, and this was a really neat excuse to do that. I think at the end of the day, that may be why this feature is here, is because I just enjoy making CMSs. One day we'll talk about headless CMSs and my love of those as well. Maybe we'll cover that in a later video, but that's basically it for our news and CMS session. We have one more video planned, and that is about our internationalization, adding more lang packs and that kind of thing. And I'll see you then.